Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you're zooming in from. And I'd just like to say to everybody, thank you so much for joining this webinar. I'm here and joined by my lovely panelists, which you'll get to know a bit later in the call. And then Amy Maltz as well. Amy, if you want to give a bit of a wave.
Hi everyone.
And she is joining us as the co-host from the Loretto community. So my name's Francesca and I'm the current youth representative for the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary Loretto Generalate NGO at the United Nations in partnership with the Congregation of Jesus. And before we get into the nitty gritty of this, I just want to do a quick tech announcement. So attendees, so if you're watching this and you're not speaking today, you will not be able to turn your video or your audio on. But we do encourage you to engage with the chat. So at the bottom, if you're on your computer, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a speech bubble that says chat, and you can click on that and feel free to engage as much as you like in there. And then if you're on your phone, on the bottom right-hand side, you should see 3 dots and you can click that and the chat option will come up. So we encourage everyone to use the chat if you have any technical questions. Amy or I will get back to you, questions for the speakers or any comments at all, that's up for your disposal. So again, thank you for joining us. The purpose of this webinar is mostly to give young people a platform to speak about their experiences and their perspectives, and in this case on gender equality. So we'll be hearing from 6 speakers, each of whom will be speaking on their personal experience in one aspect related to gender equality. So we've got their names up here. So as you can see, we're looking at gender-based violence, economic justice and rights and the workforce, reproductive health rights and equitable healthcare for women, climate justice, technology and innovation, and finally, feminist movements and leadership. So I just wanted to give everyone a bit of a background on the context for this webinar and what these generation equality themes are. So 2020 is a big year for the United Nations and for global feminism. So this year marks 25 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Now, this was a milestone global framework aiming to move forward the empowerment of women and girls. And despite a lot of action, a lot of global action moving towards a more equal world for all genders, to this day, not one country can claim to have achieved gender equality. And so on its anniversary this year, on the 25 years since that Beijing conference, the UN Women, which is the UN of the United Nations mandated group for women, created this revolutionary campaign called Generation Equality. And the subtext to this is realizing women's rights for an equal future, aiming to bring together all generations. And that's including those who attended the Beijing World Conference 25 years ago, and also the young people who are just getting started in their and building their advocacy careers in this space. And so to commemorate this, the UN had been preparing for some global conversations between key decision holders this year in Mexico and Paris. And another event to invigorate the work of generation equality was the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations in New York. So this was meant to be held from the 9th of March to the 20th of March. Now, fortunately, it was cancelled due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And then also, similarly, right now, it was meant to be held on March 31st to April 2nd, the ECOSOC Youth Forum, which was the kind of core youth engagement forum at the United Nations. And this was cancelled. This year, we also commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And in commemoration of this, the UN was holding a big campaign called UN 75, which aimed to be the greatest ever global conversation. So these were kind of 4 events that were occurring this year or meant to be occurring right now. And I guess this webinar is a bit of a partnership of the outcomes of all these events. Because obviously at this time we're going through some very challenging global circumstances, and we do want to address this, so the current COVID-19 pandemic. And I mean, this is something that has affected the global community very quickly and with a lot of force, and it will be something that will impact the entire community without a doubt right now and for the near future. And so I hope everyone's able to stay home when they can, and I'm very grateful for those working on the front line to actively combat COVID-19. I guess for me, working in this space, it's been when I've been thinking a lot about how I can reduce the damage of COVID-19 myself and how I can work towards helping other people overcome the challenges related to the coronavirus, I found it also important that the pandemic doesn't mask a lot of the global issues that we have been fighting for and advocating for. So issues such as the climate crisis, the refugee crisis, even things like access to clean water, access to education, gender equality, these issues haven't stopped because of the coronavirus. And in many cases, these issues have and will become exacerbated. So I guess a few questions have come up for me in this time. And they include things as though, like, how can we continue to advocate for these global challenges while we're all working together from a distance, while being sensitive to the current circumstances related to the pandemic and people's different experiences? And almost more importantly, in a time with a lot of confusion and fear and sadness, how can we continue to be inspired and enthused about our advocacy and keep opening up space to connect and collaborate and working towards these issues? And I guess that's the crux of what we're here for today, to be inspired by these perspectives of these young people and their experiences with advocacy and acting for change. So the current generation of young people is the biggest the human population has ever seen. So more young people on the planet today than there ever has been before. We're active members of the global community and certainly an active and prominent group, and current policies and decisions impact our future greatly. But unfortunately, there are limited spaces for young people to get involved at a high level, at a decision-making level, where they can make actionable impact. And in commemoration of the ECOSOC Youth Forum, we wanted to give space for young people to speak openly about their experiences and also to hear from young people about their passions and about their interests, because we all know how much more engaging it can be when you hear someone speak about what they're passionate about. So today on our panel, we do acknowledge that the experiences are largely based in the USA and Australia. So it's a limited perspective, but there's a lot of breadth within those countries. But I will discuss at the end of this webinar our intentions to continue this conversation with voices from all over the globe. So getting started, each participant will have a bit of time to present to you based on their theme. And then at the end of these presentations, there'll be about 15 minutes for a Q&A, so question and answer. So keep an eye on the chat box too, as Amy and I will be pulling out some key quotes and messages as the panelists speak to keep that chat engaged, but feel free to pop your questions down there as they're speaking and we can come back to them. So without further ado, I'd first like to welcome our first speaker, Bridget Branning, who will be speaking on the first theme, which is gender-based violence. So Bridget, feel free to turn on your video and go on unmute, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. So as she said, I am Bridget Branning, and I am currently working as a trauma therapist as well as the clinical coordinator at Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. So I'm based in Cleveland. I did see Beth in the chat box. Hi, Beth. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So I have a lot of experience with gender-based violence in my agency. We serve survivors of all ages, all genders, all types of victimization. And from my perspective, I feel like my youth perspective has been rewarded and acknowledged at my agency in ways that are unexpected. So the clinical coordinator title that I hold is actually something that was crafted for me. The reason for this is because a lot of the time, people naturally come to the youth, so to me in particular, for assistance with things like systems, but also with understanding things like gender identity and topics that may be a little bit new to folks that might have been practicing clinically for a long time. So when I think about how youth are shaping the way that we think about gender inclusive policy, I think about how youth have, what to me, in my experience, an elevated understanding of gender dynamics, an elevated understanding of the ways in which we conceptualize gender roles impact our survivorship status. So for example, at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, we have programs that are specifically targeted towards accessing Latinx communities and particularly Latino men. So we think about the way that the idea of machismo and just manhood in general can actually impact someone's survivorship status. I think that historically, the idea is for the rape crisis movement, it was largely focused around women and sometimes children, but we're starting to broaden the understanding of who is impacted by sexual violence, because it is all genders. And so we think about the ways that intersectionality has really come to the forefront. And I think that's due in large part because of the youth view, the ability of the youth to understand the global intersections of sexual violence and gender-based violence. When I think about that, I think about the barriers that historically people that do not fit in the binary have faced kind of in their ability to come forward. So for example, we have support groups, and support groups typically they fall along the gender binary. So we have a men's support group and a women's support group. And more, which is a very good sign, we're having folks come forward who are not fitting in that binary, and they're comfortable telling us that, which means that we're doing something right. But the structures that are inherent in our systems with that gender binary have made it so that they're inaccessible services. Some rape crisis centers don't serve men and don't serve non-binary folks. They're targeted just towards women and children. And so I think more and more often we're starting to understand, because of the youth perspective, how we have focused so largely on just women, and haven't really taken into consideration all of the intersections that really impact what makes gender-based violence so abhorrent and so power-based. So those dynamics are so important for us to understand. I think about how we're learning more and more about how to serve everyone and how to support all survivors, regardless of gender identity, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of status, immigration status. So I think it's been a big learning experience, and I know that I've had to lean in to try to work through generational differences and generational understandings that definitely differ. But in my perspective, I have been really respected and rewarded for bringing my perspective to the table. I have felt that I've put in a little bit more labor in educating some folks, but I'm glad that at least that door is opening and people are opening themselves up to understanding how gender-based violence is not violence against women all the time. So yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Bridget, for your perspective. I think it's really interesting, and I think that discussion about opening up gender-based violence beyond maybe just the discussion of gender-based violence towards women is extremely important. And I know that I do see in my own experience a lot of young people as well driving for that knowledge amongst everybody. So thank you for that. We are going to skip next to Jacqueline, who will be speaking on women's right to healthcare. And we look forward to her perspective very much. So I'd like to bring Jacqueline on if you're ready to go. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Francesca. As Francesca said, my name is Jacqueline Witwicky, and I am a representative with the Congregations of St. Joseph doing a year of service with the organization. Just a quick disclaimer, as has been said before, this will have a bit of a United States-centric perspective. I will be speaking from my own experience to an extent, as well as from research that I did as an undergraduate. And in doing this, it is a bit US-centric, but a lot of the issues I will be discussing do apply broader to other countries and other situations as well. Jumping into my own experience with the issue of women in the healthcare system, particularly in reference to reproductive health. I, around the age of 10, began experiencing pain and discomfort associated with my menstrual cycle. This was persistent, it was ongoing, and it was distracting from daily life. When I brought this up to family members, to medical professionals, doctors, I would get shot down. A lot of the responses I received were along the lines of, this is what womanhood is. It's discomfort, it's pain, get used to it, essentially. Now, in my early 20s, I went in for my first regular pelvic exam, where I was immediately diagnosed with a reproductive health issue that required surgical intervention to correct, so that I could stop experiencing this discomfort. And so if I chose to, eventually I could have children. Now, my experience with being misdiagnosed and kind of pushed aside is not entirely uncommon in the US healthcare system for women. It takes a woman 2 years and 3 doctors on average in the United States to be diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS. On top of that, the United States has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the developed world, particularly when compared to countries of comparable wealth. The most recent statistic is 17.4 out of every 100,000 women pass away while giving birth or within 40 days following. This is unacceptable, and there are several reasons why these statistics are so truly shocking and why this is the case in the United States. One of the first things that jumps out is the research gap. What this means is essentially there is a higher percentage of research and research funding dedicated to men's reproductive health issues than there are for women's reproductive health issues. Just a quick snapshot, an example of this. There are 5 times as many studies done on erectile dysfunction than there are on PMS. Comparably, 90% of women at some point in their lifetime, to some degree, experience symptoms of PMS, whereas only 20% of men experience symptoms of erectile dysfunction. With these percentages being what they are, the research gap is simply unacceptable. Another reason why reproductive health statistics in the United States are so disheartening is due to lack of education. Only 17 out of 50 states require that sex education and education taught in schools in reference to sex and women's health be medically accurate. 17 out of 50 states. Now, what this results in is women not being able to identify their own symptoms, not being able to advocate for themselves, not knowing when something is wrong. And because of this, we have these disheartening outcomes. Along those lines, it's very important to pay attention to who is speaking in the conversation of women's health and healthcare rights. And this is a bit where the youth perspective comes in. Bridget mentioned the importance of intersectionality, and this comes into play here. A lot of the reason why maternal mortality is so high in the United States, a lot of the reason why it takes so long to be diagnosed with something like polycystic ovarian syndrome is because of a lack of intersectionality in the healthcare system. A lot of doctors are disproportionately white Americans. And because of this, women of color and women in rural areas have their concerns at times pushed aside, or they're not understood. This is also due to the education gap. It's no secret that race is an issue in the United States. It's no secret that class is an issue in the United States, and this transfers into reproductive health care. So when we pay attention to who is speaking in the conversation regarding women's healthcare and reproductive care, it's very important to ensure that women of color, women on the margins, that their voices are brought to the forefront. Because so often the issues faced by upper class and upper middle class white women are not the issues faced by women of color. And while what happened to me in the healthcare system, the way I was treated was horrible, I can't imagine what it is like for women of color. So it's very important that the stories of women of color are brought to the forefront of this conversation, that their voices are raised up. That leads us into how can the situation be rectified? How can we ensure that these horrible statistics, this high rate of maternal mortality, this excruciatingly long diagnosis time in the United States, how can we rectify this? One way, of course, would be to narrow that research gap, to dedicate funds, to dedicate research to women's reproductive health care, to reproductive health care, particularly in rural areas and lower income areas. Another way would be to ensure that education be medically accurate so that women are able to be advocates for themselves and identify their own symptoms And then, of course, to lift up the voices of women of color and women in rural areas, and to share the stories of women in general. A lot of the reason why I open this talk with my own story, and I've given this talk a couple different times in varying different formats, is because once you know someone who has dealt with mistreatment in the healthcare system, it's so much easier to put a face to the issue and then advocate for it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline, for sharing your perspective, especially a very personal perspective. It certainly rang through very strongly. And I think it's a great message. I remember in the Commission for Social Development earlier in the year, we heard the phrase, "Don't speak about us without us." And I think that's that's a very good message to have in these times as well. So next, I would like to bring on Shiv, who will be presenting on climate justice. I would like to thank Shiv for coming, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Like Francesca said, my name is Shiv. I'm 19 years old, and I'm currently a second-year student at NYU, New York University. I am a climate justice activist based in New York. So I kind of wanted to start out this talk talking a little bit about the intersection of women and climate. And I'm really glad that Jacqueline went right before me, because a lot of what I'm about to focus on is reproductive health, also women's education. I highly recommend, I actually pulled it. I have something called, there's this book called Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And I really enjoy this book because one of the biggest points that I always hear about climate justice is that it's an environmental issue. There isn't really intersections with a lot of different issues that people are talking about. Well, pretty much I like to argue that climate justice intersects with pretty much every issue that you can think about. And women's rights, reproductive health, women's education are one of the main issues that you can talk about. So to kind of understand where that connection comes from, if reproductive health and education are the single biggest actions we can take in regards to women to reduce emissions altogether. And the way that happens is when you uplift women, when you educate them, and when I say educate, I mean a 12-year primary education, you see these maternal mortality rates drop. You see that with this knowledge that they're gaining, you're able to bring this information back home, fuel the knowledge, and use them in agricultural plots and industrial world. And there are economic studies after economic studies that have said that investment in educating girls is highly cost competitive with almost every single option you can think of for carbon emissions. And there's a rough estimate that educating girls and reproductive health, like putting together all of that, could result in 59.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide reductions by 2050. And a gigaton, for those who may not know, is a billion tons, 1 gigaton. So 59.6 gigatons is quite a lot altogether. And this is where the intersections really come in. And that's what's so fascinating about climate justice. And like I said, I am a climate justice organizer based in New York City. And I'll touch a little bit about what my organizing experience looks like and what I like to mention as well. One of the biggest facts that I like to throw out is that 70% of our emissions that do come out in the world are only from 75 corporations. And that is a stunning fact when you really think about it, that there's so many issues going on in regards to our emissions, and only 75 entities and companies are responsible for 75% of the world's emissions. And that's really a lot. So what that really means when you're organizing for climate justice is that you have to fight these systemic battles that are with us, and like putting the pressure on corporations, putting the pressure on our governments to take action. And I see a lot of actions from even companies, like, I don't know if you might have seen Shell on Twitter some time ago was advertising how you can check your own carbon footprint. Sorry, that was BP. How you can check your own carbon footprint and reduce that. And that's kind of taking away how Shell is one of the top 5 emitters, how BP is one of the top 5 emitters in the entire world. So I always like to say then that we need to understand how our individual role plays in this and take some individual actions, but we can't forget about this larger systemic action. And over the last year, the youth have really taken quite a large role in the fight for climate justice and ensuring that we actually are moving in a positive path that is listening to the science and understanding the urgency of the science. So as many of you might know of the name Greta Thunberg, she is a 16-year-old girl from Sweden who began protesting outside the Swedish parliament. And this really sparked a youth movement throughout the world. And there have been large protests that have happened all across the world as well. So we had one large one on September 20th, which was our largest one to date, with around 7 million people globally. I don't know how many of you might have participated in it, but there were around 7 million people who really participated and really were active. And that is an insane number. This was right before the UN met, the UN General Assembly, and that led to a lot of different actions happening and a lot of different commitments from our governments. So as we're looking at the role of youth in this movement, the youth have really shattered quite a glass into allowing us to get into these discussions. But we're still not there, by no means. We have now gotten our foot into the door, and I think Francesca said this earlier at the very beginning, that one of the biggest issues is that youth aren't involved in these higher decision making. When it comes to the fight with climate justice, we're seeing youth once again bringing their foot in, starting to make these demands, making sure that they're holding their elected leaders accountable, but we're not there yet. And what that means is that we need to organize more, we need to bring more people in, and that's where the fight for climate justice is. And what that also means is that we need more women, we need more people at the forefront of this fight, because once again, I said this a little bit earlier, but women are disproportionately the most affected when it comes to the impacts of climate justice. And that's simply just because of any sort of those consequences, what that may look like, whether those are natural disasters that are heightened, whether those are systemic inequalities, those will impact women more. And women are stepping forward. There are lots of, I work with a lot of amazing women who have been in this fight, and we're continuing to bring more in. And that also means bringing women who who have already been marginalized, who are people of color, Indigenous women. That really means bringing in young people, young women who have these experiences to bring this fight together. Just quite simply, we're not there yet, and we need to go there. So that's pretty much all I have to say. And if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shiv. An amazing way to bring together kind of all aspects of your talk. So gender equality, the climate crisis, and the youth movement. I think it's also really interesting to hear about a way that we can tackle climate change that's beyond kind of just scientific actions and environmentalist actions. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Next up, I would like to introduce Meizhu Wang, who will be speaking on the topic of technology and innovation.
Hi everyone. Sorry, my camera isn't working. My name is Meizhu. I'm doing a Master of Data Science program at the University of Rochester. So I don't really directly work on any gender inequality issues. So I'm working more like technology track and trying to build the tools to solve issues. For example, the gender equality. My background is actually economics and business, and I was very interested in learning econometrics, statistics, and mathematics. So I decided to do this master to learn more about big data. I'm currently doing an internship at the UN Executive Office of Secretary General. Here I help them to build data pipelines, maintain data products, and support analytics. So more specifically, I do research in data source, data quality, and build dashboard, and to use the statistics, machine learning to do data modeling, testing. I do programming in Python. I write mQuery in Power BI. And before joining UN, I also worked on a EU project called Hidalgo, where we used machine learning to investigate the social media message spreading patterns to detect fraud, and designed the algorithm to build roadmap for refugee fleeing so that NGOs and the UN can better know where to provide resources for the refugees. Also, I have done a project where I used also data science tools to classify the degree of depression of patients using physical data like brainwaves. So now, speaking of gender equality, in the field of data science, I think there are basically two functions. One is more towards analytics and another one is more to engineering. As far as I see in the analytics part, there's no gender inequality issue. I think in the job market, there are even more successful girls in this field more than guys. But in the engineering part, which is more coding, programming intensive, it's like same as all other traditional engineering subjects like computer science, electronic engineering. I think there's a very big gender gap. I believe that young people, especially young ladies, should be more involved into both functions because data science is getting more and more important in any big organization decision making. So the more involved into the field means more social attention the young lady can draw to solve their problems. And data science is a lot about creatively using big data tools to find insights. So anyone's opinion, including female and male perspective, should all be utilized, combined together to find the best solution. I'm happy to chat more in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you, Meizhu, for your perspective. And when Meizhu and I were speaking earlier in the week, and she was kind of talking about how her stream of data science in terms of the analytical stream, in a lot of ways, there are a lot of women being actively involved and a lot of opportunities for women to engage. So that was a great success story, I think, in an industry to hear, although there is still a bit more work to do on the engineering side, which was very interesting to hear about as well. So next up, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Amy Maltz, who will be speaking on feminist movements and leadership.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Francesca, for the intro. Again, my name is Amy Maltz. I'm the current Assistant UN Representative for the Loretto community, which is a UN NGO. We represent Catholic laywomen and Catholic sisters with the mission to work for justice and act for peace. And today I wanted to, of course, outline what I think of when I hear the words feminist movements in leadership. And my immediate thought is to the waves of feminism, and that as much as we can quantify it, which is to say imperfectly, feminist movements are marked in waves. The first beginning with suffrage. The second wave tends to focus on fighting for respect for women in the world of work, moving women from restrictions from the private sphere into the public sphere. And the third wave tends to focus more on intersectionality, which many of us have mentioned today. And I just want to quickly define that, which is to say that, to me, intersectionality is the ways in which experiences of oppression and marginalization are layered on top of one another, compounded, and changed depending on the interlocking aspects of one's identity, everything from gender to race to sexuality, geographic location, language spoken. The identities kind of go on and on. So the third wave of feminism, at least as I was taught, is where that notion kind of first comes into feminist movements and leadership. And then some say that we are currently in a fourth wave, which is ongoing and tends to encompass a reclaiming of autonomy and sexuality and a continued focus on intersectionality and quite possibly a more primary focus on intersectionality. And I could go on for ages on the ways in which, different feminist movements have changed and morphed across regions of the world and throughout the years. But I think the inherent drawbacks to the notion of the waves and the notion of feminism and feminist movements as a whole is that there is a premise that these movements have been traditionally held in positions of power by white women or white folks, and that inherently other populations such as women of color or other people who fall outside of heteronormativity are often left out of the conversation. So when I look around and witness the various movement makers and feminist leaders that are currently in action, I don't necessarily feel that we are operating in a wave at this moment, although maybe in years later I'll look back and disagree with myself. But personally, when I think of the movement we are in now, I define what I align with feminism as intersectional feminism, always acknowledging that given the problematic histories of the term feminism, we must always strive and reform to ensure that all individuals feel represented, acknowledged, and heard through the movement. In terms of the way that the Action Coalition of feminist movements and leadership has operated, from my experience working for a UN NGO, much of my time in my current position has been spent working alongside various other NGOs who have been preparing and strategizing for the Generation Equality Forum and for the Commission on the Status of Women, which we all now know has unfortunately been postponed due to COVID-19. In particular, the Loretto community is a proud member of the Working Group on Girls as well as NGO CSW, so both organizations that really work to highlight advocacy for gender equality within the context of the United Nations. And when I first began in this position, what I found so in line with my own principles as a younger person in particular was the attention that is verbally paid in the UN Women Action Coalitions and Generation Equality Forum, that there is attention paid to intersectionality, and there is a specific outline of cross-cutting issues that should go through all of the action coalitions, not just feminist movements and leadership. And one of the most notable cross-cutting issues that they are striving towards is the notion of transforming gender norms, and that this should be addressed, of course, through all action coalitions. And on the outside, the notion of transforming gender norms, to me, resonates as deconstructing binaries and allowing for inclusivity across the lines of gender, race, religious background, etc. And it does appear to be paid attention to and uplifted across the action coalitions. The one caveat to this, I would say, is from personal experience, what I have encountered during my time working for an NGO at the UN is that this kind of idea of breaking out of binaries, transforming gender norms, and intersectionality is not necessarily divisive along generational lines, but certainly is not talked about fluently alongside gender lines. And consistently, I see language that is proposed in declarations, in advocacy strategies, and in statements that is coming directly out of organizations and groups that advocate for gender equity, continue to use binary language that will inevitably, although I'm sure not deliberately, perpetuate oppression towards those that identify, in particular as trans, gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, or otherwise. And what I have also witnessed is that it does tend to be youth voices within the space of UN NGOs that do point out that this binary language is continued to be used. And it is when youth voices point that out that attention is paid to it and that conversations do begin to open. And I think the reason for this is perhaps a result of the ways in which waves of feminist movements have morphed and changed alongside the growth of generations. Different generations simply have different definitions and priorities within the feminist movements that they have been inoculated in. But I think doubtless a key priority of the younger generation is going to be opening up the gender binary and truly encompassing intersectionality. As I said before, what I've witnessed during my time working for a UNGO is that the role that civil society plays in devising advocacy strategies towards these action coalitions in preparation for CSW is incredibly important. And the youth that are a part of these circles are also incredibly important. And I think truly as we look forward to thinking, what can we do to kind of mesh these different movements together, mesh these generations and priorities together, is to continue to turn to youth to allow us, I suppose, to continue to push the envelope, particularly when it comes to intersectionality, transforming gender norms in the gender binaries. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I really want to thank you for speaking so much about intersectionality and what that means. And I think specifically for a large issue or a large theme such as gender equality. and as we speak a lot about in terms of generation equality, the campaign, and CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. These issues are so there's so much meat to them, there's so much weight to them, and we simply cannot move forward in these issues unless we acknowledge that intersectionality and how much these different cross-cutting aspects really join together. And in terms of moving towards solutions, how imperative it is that we consider all aspects of and all perspectives of the issue. So I would like to invite all our panelists to turn their video back on if possible, and we'll all come back together. And I'd like to invite as many any questions from the attendees and for the audience. If you have a specific question to a specific person, please put their name in the question. Otherwise, if it's a general question, happy to draw on those. So I see we have one question right now from Cecilia O'Dwyer. What advice would you give to older generations to advance intersectionality? Do we have any takers for this? Jacqueline, do you want to start?
Well, I would just like to bring up the point that you brought up earlier, which was really a big theme of the Commission on Social Development. Don't talk about us without us. Raising up voices of individuals that have had experiences other than your own when looking at issues of intersectionality, instead of speaking for someone, instead of telling another person's story, bring that person into the room and give them the opportunity to share their story and share their needs. One of the reasons this worked so well at the Commission for Social Development is because experts with lived experience, the theme was homelessness in housing, experts with lived experience of homelessness, of housing insecurity, were brought into the UN, brought into rooms and able to share their story, which is so much more accurate, so much more effective, and so much more impactful than someone, you know, like me telling someone's story. It's so much better to give people the opportunity to share their own experiences and advocate for their own change. I hope that answers your question.
See, we also have another question from Olivia from Manchester, UK. Has a question for Bridget specifically. I was wondering how you are managing to maintain this work at this difficult time, especially with people in indefinite isolation with abusers. How are these additional barriers affecting the support you are able to offer? Thank you.
That is such a good question, Olivia. Part of what I've been doing actually for the past couple of weeks as the clinical coordinator is developing policy around telehealth. There definitely are considerations for survivors that are very different than others that might be clients for therapy that are a little bit more resourced. So the first question that you asked about clients who are in isolation with abusers was exactly where my mind went. As soon as the stay-at-home order in Cleveland was put into place, which maybe means I focused too much on work because I didn't think about myself, I thought about them. But I do actually currently work with a couple of clients who are sheltering in place with abusers. I think because of the complicated dynamics that we know about leaving an abusive situation or relationship, it is a process. And so some folks are in the beginning of that process, and some folks were at the end, but then were told to shelter in place. We've developed really strong relationships with the shelters in our area for survivors and survivors of human trafficking. And I think one of the other things, aside from shelter and financial needs being something that a lot of folks are focusing on and needing right now, another thing that is just a consideration is that this is a traumatizing incident in and of itself. And so most of the clients that I'm working with are in heightened activated states. They are being triggered by the health crisis, and then they have their coping skills completely removed from them because they are not able to connect with folks as easily. They're not able to go to places that might be soothing to them, or engage in self-care activities, or purchase things that might be helpful. So I think we're taking it one day at a time, and I'm very upfront with my clients. Obviously, they know that this is something that's happening to me too. So I tell them that I am human. I'm struggling too, and we're going to learn together how to make this new reality work for us, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bridget. We have another question directly for Shiv. What do you think is the reason why there are more women involved in and at the forefront of the fight for environmental justice?
That's a really good question, Lucas, and I quite honestly don't have an answer, and I'll kind of explain why. It's something that we've definitely seen. It's a very obvious global trend that there are more women at the forefront, like in terms of like the people that the media seems to fixate on. I will say though that I think that on the grassroots level, when you're looking at that, I definitely see a little bit more widespread. And I definitely do think that when it comes to the media, I think they do make a good decision with highlighting women who are at the forefront of this. But I definitely do want to, I think that's actually a better way of phrasing it, that the media definitely highlights and appropriately highlights the women, Indigenous women, people of color, who are women, who are at the forefront of this fight, who are leading amazing organizations. Two of them that come to mind, one international organization for youth is Jamie Margolin and Nadia Nazir. I'm just throwing out names, but those are two women who are in high school who are leading this international movement called 0 Hours. So I think that they are two large spokespeople for the movement. But as we look throughout, I definitely do think that there is I think there is more balance between men and women, but I also do think that as we go forward, we need to make sure that everyone is involved in this fight. And what that means is really taking this fight to your family and also showing them how they should get involved, how every single person there needs to be calling the representatives, needs to be getting involved, needs to be holding corporations accountable. That's kind of how I see it, but I still don't really have a solid answer. And I don't know who might, I think some of those questions it's a little difficult to answer, but that's just kind of where my mind automatically goes.
Francesca, would you like to pick the next question? I don't want to hog picking all the questions from the chat.
Sure. There was a statement from Maureen, and she said, I wish to hear more on the youth and technology and innovation, because it's one of the major ways in which we can reach out to the youth. And so I guess pulling from this, how can we use technology and how can we use different innovative platforms to reach out to young people and enable them to engage in advocacy and in global change? Meizhu, did you have any perspective on this?
I think that now there's definitely more and more young women involved into the whole innovation and the technology field, which is definitely a great thing. Also, for example, in the history of computers, the computer needs to be hard coded. Like you have to code every binary electrical signal to make the computer run. But for now, actually, for all the tools, for all the data science stuff I have mentioned, like machine learning, statistics, all of this, and also Python, which is the easiest programming language to use. There are a lot of libraries, there's a lot of open source resources for everybody to pick it up very easily. So this opens the gap for gender equality very much, because the technology work is no longer hard and exhausting. Everybody can involve, and even young people, like girls, and like everyone, if they have an opinion, they can try out, they can pull a data set that they think is relevant and try to have an opinion and use the real data. So I think that now there's a very good tendency that with all these big data tools and with all these communication technologies, there will be more opinion from young people and young girls to be heard. Thank you.
I'll add on to that too. I think that when it comes to youth and technology, I've seen really interesting intersections. And I do think that it does stem from there should be some sort of incubation that really should foster this. And I think that can come from a few different ways. Around, I would say October, I was working with this international effort using technology to plant around, or the goal was 1 billion to like 1 trillion trees. Like we made the number very large, but the whole goal was to make this international effort using data, using gridding, using all these technologies around us to allow people to plant X amount of trees in their community, while also taking into account the ecology, while also taking into account the population density, all these factors. And that relies on technology. So what we ended up doing was we've recruited people from, I believe the numbers are really fuzzy right now, but around 20 to 25 countries. We put together these toolkits and held phone calls with them bi-weekly to give them the mentorship, the technology. But this was really meant for not us to like steer the ship, but it was meant for us to be like, what are your questions and how can we help you? And then letting them go and do what they need. So essentially what I think is really important is young people have the ability and the desire to do all these things. It's just really about where the resources are coming from. And that sort of like helping hand to really do that, because these types of things, you really need the resources. So once you're able to do that, we were able to get very close to our goal, and it was really amazing. I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, sorry about that, but there is really a great intersection between youth and technology, and I do think that it comes from these efforts and being able to develop those going forward. So yeah, that's something that I worked on that I found very interesting.
Awesome, thank you. There is a specific question for Jacqueline, and this is submitted by Margaret. Jacqueline, with COVID-19, there's a groundswell of conversation about the need for healthcare reform in the US. How can we be sure women's health is a big part of that conversation?
Thank you, Margaret, for your question. This is obviously a very relevant issue right now, not just looking at how women's health is part of the conversation of reform, but also how women specifically are impacted by the COVID-19 epidemic. Obviously, it is too soon to know what the full consequences of this pandemic will be, but I have seen a lot of preliminary writings and research that indicates, particularly in Western countries, that women are disproportionately impacted. Women occupy a lot of the fields that are deemed necessary. They are a large percentage of nurses, and not just the healthcare outcomes associated with how women will be affected by COVID-19, but the burden of work outcomes as well. Women, particularly women who are now working from home, are also taking on a burden of childcare, of educator, of housekeeper, when typically that may not be a burden of work that they're taking. So the implications for women in this pandemic is really startling. The whole situation is startling, of course, but the implications for women are something that should be considered. Now, ensuring that moving forward, women are a part of the conversation of healthcare reform is, I would just reiterate again, to bring voices of women, to bring voices of women at the margins into the room, to ensure that it's not just anecdotes being brought forward, but if you are in a place of power, in a place of advocacy, that you use the stories of women in your advocacy, not just their stories, but their voices as well. I hope that answers your question. Obviously, this is a very difficult time for everyone. And as I said, we can't know what the full consequences will be, but I do think that it's important to keep women's healthcare in mind moving forward. Thank you for your question.
Got a question here from Winifred. Does sharing feminism have cultural implications? Any thought on how to share it in other cultures? Amy, did you have a perspective on this one?
Yes, that is a great question. Oh, am I muted? Yes, we're good. Yes, let me marinate on that for a second. Yes, I think sharing feminism does have cultural implications. There is this entire kind of sector of feminist history that focuses on colonial feminism and the ways in which Western notions of feminism have actually brought harm and been used as a tool to increase, imperial power in other countries. And so I think just to echo kind of what Jacqueline said earlier, in that we need to focus on, the notion of nothing about us without us. I think feminism means different things to different people in all parts of the world, in all facets of different identities. And each of those people and individuals and communities deserves to take autonomy over what feminism means for them and what liberation looks like for them. And so I think in terms of sharing in other cultures, like share away, but not in a way that, or not with the intention of power behind it.
Fantastic. Amy, I know you thought of a few discussion questions earlier. Did you have kind of one question that we can ask to all panelists that the panelists can kind of use their final bit of time to speak on, just like with a quick response?
Ooh, yes. I did write a few questions up, and as usual, time is not our friend. So this will be a final one for all of the panelists. I would say, if there is one suggestion that all of us have for the UN and its agencies to better involve youth in promoting and advocacy and furthering gender equality, what would it be? I'm going to turn it over to other people because I asked that question.
Well, speaking similarly as the perspective you brought earlier, Amy, being a part of civil society at the UN, I feel like a lot of the youth initiatives that I've observed at the UN have been fantastic. A lot of initiatives for countries to have youth representatives, for there to be youth forums, youth panels are fantastic. But it does feel a bit like it's still an aside, an afterthought. I would like to see more instances of youth in leadership roles, not just in support roles. And this is something we're starting to see, not just at the UN, but in government, in policy in general, globally. I think the work that's been done is truly fantastic. And all of these spaces that I've observed for youth at the UN have been really inspiring and powerful. And I would just like to keep seeing that trajectory of growth, and to continue to see youth in not just positions of support, but positions of leadership as well. Thank you.
I think I can go next. So like what Jacqueline said with the youth experiences at the UN, I've had many positive experiences with them. I've had also some negative experiences as well, like I'll be very honest. And I think what I learned from that is, quite frankly, and I think I have to say this to like youth organizers quite a lot, and it's just know your value and like don't accept being talked down to, because I think that a lot of times what happens is what Jacqueline said with the aside, I think was a really good point. Like sometimes at the UN, I felt like some of the youth events, and I'll specifically talk about the Youth Climate Summit that they had before the actual UN General Assembly, was essentially they were teaching us how to make viral videos instead of like allowing us to engage with actual leaders that were meeting the next day. So it was very separated, and it didn't just bother me, it bothered a lot, almost every youth activist that was there. So what I would definitely say is hold your value up and allow like yourself to move forward. Like you are young, but that doesn't mean you don't have value, you don't have input that can make consequential change. And for me, what I think happened is that took me some time to break down that wall personally. And once I was able to do that, especially in the UN setting, I was able to get in touch with some more officials to move the ball forward for youth representation. So in all, it's just definitely don't undervalue yourself as a young person, because I cannot tell you how many times I see that and how many times I've had to say that to people. So I'm just throwing that out there as well, especially in a UN context. Like absolutely not. Like hold yourself up and make sure you understand what your value is.
I'd like to echo what both of you say. Even outside of the UN, in my position, I feel like I have been consistently underestimated. I have been, and not just by the employees and the staff and leadership at my agency, but even by my clients. They see a young face and they're like, you're not going to get it. And so I feel like in a lot of ways, I've needed to become a self-advocate. There have been so many barriers that have stood in my way to being in the position that I'm in right now. And I think that had I been 10 years older, I would have had this position 3 years ago. And so I think that when I think about that, I think it's important for leaders to remove those barriers whenever possible. And instead of asking folks to work, 10 times as hard, instead be really leaning into professional development. I think that you should really be leaning into kind of cultivating the person that you're working with and thinking about their full potential, as opposed to making them prove it. So I guess basically don't underestimate us would be what I would say to your question, Amy.
Thank you. And I'd like Francesca to also answer if you don't mind. I'd love to hear your perspectives as well.
I don't mind at all. I agree with everything that's been said so far from everybody, so thank you. I just wanted to bring up, so this year is the 75th anniversary of the UN, and they're holding the UN 75 campaign. And a core aspect of this campaign is that the UN is listening. And I went to an event earlier in the year, which was a youth-led and youth-focused event. I had a panel of 6 young people, and then the Secretary General was facilitating the panel. And at the start, he said, "No one asked me any questions because I'm here to listen." And the wealth of knowledge and experience and perspective that came out of these discussions, where young people they felt they were being sincerely heard. I just think creating more spaces like that, spaces like this where we are today, where people just feel as though they can be heard, understood, and their experiences held, I think is very important moving forward. Meizhu, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Sure. So from the technology perspective, I think what you can do is to have to make more access for the young people to have access to internet and to the whole discussion about global issues. For example, sometimes when trying to deal with the big data problems, one problem is that we don't have the data for the country which are not in very good development. And if for the people there can have the most basic access to internet and the computers and basic maybe programming knowledge and the database knowledge, then I'm sure that it will be so much easier for them to discuss what is their problem and how can we help them. And also they can share their lot of opinions. And then also from like if I work on like the issues for young people, one important thing is that we UN can maybe set up more projects, more focus on young people, and spend more time collecting data about young people, more specifically, instead of just getting the data for the whole population, and spend more time to do exploratory analysis on the data of young people to get pattern which will lead to more further analytics. So to pay attention, then it will lead to like more research or more attention from many groups. Thanks.
Thank you. And Amy, did you want to have a final message? And then I'll just close up with some admin things.
Yes, and I'm actually just going to take this final kind of moment to echo what everyone has already said, but to also just say thank you. I'm just scrolling through the chat and there's so many wonderful questions that we weren't able to get to, and I just want to say thank you so much to all of the attendees for engaging so intentionally with us. It's so exciting, and we will certainly work to and be available to answer some of these other questions in the future. But I'll turn it back to you, Francesca.
So as Amy just said, thank you so much for connecting with us during this time. A big special thank you to our panelists for sharing their perspectives, especially with the personal perspectives. Unfortunately, there was one panelist who wasn't able to speak today. She was unwell, Carla, but she's going to record her presentation. And when I upload the recording of today's webinar, I'll make sure to include that, so you'll be able to see it there. I think this is a time that requires even more global collaboration than usual. A lot of active listening and understanding, a lot of supporting each other, and as we said, a lot of inspiring each other to continue to advocate for equality and peace. So thank you so much to our speakers today, who absolutely have inspired myself, and I'm sure many of the people in the chat. So as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we do hope to potentially open up this space for further dialogue. So if you enjoyed this webinar and think it would be valuable to hold again, maybe with different aspects, so maybe looking at different, rather than gender equality, a different aspect, or just intersectional in general. And if you can think of any young peoples, any young advocates or trailblazers in mind who may have a valuable contribution to add, please feel free to email Amy or I. And if you're interested in listening to something like this again, please let us know. I'll send a follow-up email with contact details for us, as well as for our panelists, so we can continue to engage. So again, thank you all for participating. Please stay safe and stay well, and we hope to see you and engage with you again.